There are individual pieces of art that I find so powerful that they have fundamentally changed how I think or experience the world. Those pieces come from a number of mediums. The video games Persona 3 Portable and the Beginner's Guide, the paintings Starry Night and the Night Watch, the Aur-Zebek dance, and the photo triptych Dropping a Han Dynasty Urn, to name a few. But the medium that contains by far the largest percentage of those works that changed me, the medium that I've loved longest and will always love deepest, is books. I love many of the books I've read as an adult, adore many of the books I read as a teenager, and revere many of the books I read as a preteen. But the ones that mean the most to me, the ones that have so deeply impacted me that you can see the core of my personality in them and their characters, are the ones that I read when I was just old enough to choose for myself what I wanted to read. The books I read from around ages 6 to 10. The countless books I read during that time period can largely be sorted into 3 categories. The first, and most numerous, are the ones that immediately slipped my mind as soon as I put them down. I may have enjoyed them well enough, or they may have bored me, but either way I never felt the need to go back to them. The second, and smallest group, are the handful of standalone or small series books that made such an impression that I would read them over and over. These are books that I typically bought personal versions of, so I didn't have to keep checking them out of the library, and I still own copies of the few that meant the most to me. The third category is the expansive episodic series that I would go out of my way to read whenever I saw an issue. It simply wasn't practical for an 8-year-old to own or keep track of the numerous volumes that would make up such a series, so I would check out whichever ones the library had available and occasionally buy one at a bookstore if one of my parents took me to the mall. These ones were usually one-and-dones because there were a million of them, and they often wouldn't appear again after I saw them the first time. But there was one series that had a specific book I would reread whenever I saw it. If it was available when I was checking out other books in the series that I hadn't read before, I would get that one as well. It was far from the most impactful of the series, it wasn't full of important plot points or crazy action scenes, and while it was extremely evocative, it was by no means uniquely so in its series. But that book kept calling to me, and the series it belonged to has always stuck in the back of my mind. So when I recently moved and was unpacking my books, my thoughts once again turned towards that series that had so deeply impacted me as a child, and I began to reread Animorphs. Animorphs is a children's sci-fi series written from 1996 to 2001 by K.A. Applegate, a pen name for Catherine Applegate and Michael Grant, who outlined the entire series and wrote the majority of it, as well as several ghostwriters who wrote individual books based on those outlines. It follows 5 teens, Leader Jake, Lancer Marco, Big Guy Rachel, Smart Guy Tobias, and Heart Cassie, who are entrusted by a dying alien called an Andalite with the knowledge of a secret invasion of Earth by an alien species called Yeerks. The Andalite, known as Elfangor, tells them that the Yeerks can take over and control human hosts and have already been on Earth for 50 years, meaning the kids can trust no one but each other. To fight the Yeerks, Elfangor gives them access to Andalite morphing technology, allowing them to transform into any animal they touch, but with the drawback of not being able to stay in a single morph for longer than 2 hours at a time without being permanently stuck in the body of that animal. The kids quickly meet up with Elfangor's little brother Axe, and the 6 of them, calling themselves the Animorphs, begin fighting a grueling 3-year-long guerrilla war against the Yeerks. Animorphs can be a bit of a tonal whiplash, as it mixes gritty violence, body horror, and the slow erosion of humanity when confronted with war, with fun animal facts, goofy sci-fi pulp, and late 90s pop culture references. The go-to example of this is Book 42, The Journey. One half of it is a fantastic voyage plot, where the Animorphs shrink and enter Marco's body to chase down a group of comedic aliens called the Helmicrons, while the other half involves Marco slowly losing his mind from rabies, culminating in the near deaths of the entire cast. It's fairly indicative of about a third of the series. Decent but mediocre writing with a take-it-or-leave-it premise that doesn't really influence or advance the overall plot. There's nothing wrong with it, but it is the textbook definition of filler. In short, it's one of the books I'd pick up at the library, read once, and never think about again. But the combination of disparate concepts that makes up Animorphs doesn't always create dissonance, because there are also entries like Book 3, The Encounter. Since it's so early in the series, it's relatively light on moral quandaries, since our cast hasn't been worn down by continued exposure to the horrors of war. Similarly, it's light on gore, and while there are some harrowing near-death experiences, they aren't described in the gruesome detail that eventually becomes a hallmark of the series. It isn't even the most psychologically intense experience that Tobias, the book's narrator, personally goes through. But The Encounter is the book that I read and reread when I was young, and it's one of the 2 Animorphs books that have always stuck in my head. The Encounter starts with a scene of Tobias and Rachel freeing a captured red-tailed hawk from a sleazy car dealership that's been using it in promotional material. Tobias has recently become trapped as a red tail himself after a failed mission where he was forced to stay in morph for more than 2 hours, so he feels some obvious kinship with the captured and exploited hawk. The scene is fun and lighthearted. Rachel turns into an elephant and stomps on cars, Tobias jokes about how Jake is going to be mad that they drew attention to themselves for little reason, and we get a nice sense of the friendship and budding romance between the two. Tobias has been trying to adjust to living as a bird, but it's understandably difficult. While his previous life was awful, stuck in an abusive home with caretakers that wanted nothing to do with him, combined with constant bullying at school, becoming a hawk is more of a lateral transition than an objective improvement. He's given up fingers and the ability to touch for the freedom and joy of being able to fly, and while he doesn't have any people to miss him, he did and does have Rachel. For the rest of the book, Tobias begins to realize that the hawk part of him is impossible to completely control. The bed of blankets that his friends made for him isn't comfortable for a hawk, the bits of hamburger meat they get him are unsatisfying, and he has nothing to do but spend the days stuck with his thoughts. He begins to fear that he's losing himself, becoming more bird than boy, so he visits Rachel in the middle of the night. Rachel does everything she can to reassure Tobias, but she's clearly worried about him. This culminates in Tobias eventually losing focus, eating a mouse, and making a mad dash through the mall to try and find Rachel when he realizes he's losing his mind. In his hysteria, he nearly smashes into the skylight of the mall at 80 miles per hour, and is only saved by Marco breaking the glass with a baseball. Tobias then spends 3 days completely as a hawk, before eventually snapping out of it and talking to a rightfully terrified Rachel. The book ends with Tobias coming to terms with the fact that he's part hawk. He accepts that he'll have to live in the middle of the food chain, sleeping in a tree and eating mice, while holding on to his humanity by spending time with his friends so they can remind him of who he is. Striking that balance is the only way for him to maintain his sanity. The relevant aspect of the encounter is that the entire narrative is based around what it's like to be a hawk, how their senses are tuned for finding prey, the mechanics of flying, etc. That exploration of wildlife is explicitly tied to the psychological horror, the character building, and the war narrative as a whole. That's Animorphs at its best, and it's a large part of why the encounter has stuck with me this long. But it's not the only reason. Tobias' experience of otherness, perpetual outsider status, and his fear that his natural inclinations are inherently monstrous in some way are not things that resonated with me when I first read it. I found them compelling, I found them fascinating, and I had a lot of sympathy for Tobias, but they just weren't things I dealt with as an 8-year-old. They were powerful enough to continually draw me back to the book, but there wasn't anything beyond that. But 4 or 5 years later, that sympathy had turned to empathy. I wasn't reading Animorphs at age 12, but Animorphs had already wormed its way into my understanding of the world. When I thought about freedom, my metaphor was and is flight. Not flight as the levitation in the way of Superman, but in the way that a bird soars on currents of air and how it flaps its wings in rounded, curving shapes. My understanding of social isolation was of existing in a fundamentally different way, of being uncomfortable with the accommodations others made for me because they were trying to fix the wrong problems. Whether subconscious or fully in mind, my self-image and the way I interacted with the world was influenced by Animorphs, even years after I read it. On my recent reread of the series, I was reminded why the encounter stuck with me so much. It still isn't the best or most impactful book in the series, it isn't even the best or most impactful Tobias book, but it still struck the same chord that it did when I was young and inexperienced with art. I could barely understand physical and emotional pain, as my breadth of experience simply wasn't wide enough when I first encountered Animorphs, and war wasn't a concept that I could even really wrap my head around. But as I grew older, the stories and characters of Animorphs stuck with me, and as I became able to perceive and understand those concepts, the commentary that suffuses Animorphs was ready and waiting for me to digest. Why are we okay with graphic violence, but not physical intimacy? Why are we okay with war crimes, but not swearing? And if we aren't okay with graphic violence and war crimes, why are we okay with putting it in the children's section of the library? Are we so concerned with what children consume that we'll heavily police it? Or do we not care enough to even know the content of the books we get them? Animorphs is fine for kids because it uses fairly simple language and revels in teaching the reader fun animal facts. But A Song of Ice and Fire is the quintessential adults-only fantasy because it uses complex prose and revels in description of food and finery. Yes, that's a bit of a reductive comparison, but the two series focus on many of the same themes, have a comparable level of graphically depicted violence, and share both a deep love for genre fiction and a deep hatred for the glorification of war. I wouldn't want my kids reading Animorphs, and if my mom knew everything that happened to them, she wouldn't have wanted me to read them either. But I'm glad I did read Animorphs when I did, and I'm glad that I'm not in a position to police what kids read. Kids deserve to be exposed to serious and painful topics in a carefully told and well-curated way, because those things stick with us, even if we never notice them without looking for them. I may not perfectly remember all the socio-political commentary in the books I read as a young child, but they definitely affected me. Going back to read those childhood books as an adult reveals all the small things that have kept a grip on my subconscious and fundamentally influenced my personality and beliefs. I'm better off and more well-adjusted today because I was given respect by creators, intelligence by media curators, and autonomy by parents. My sense of self, my personality, and my beliefs are genuine, but the specific forms they take, the touchstones I have, and the patterns of thought I most readily fall into are reflective of the art that has changed me over the years. And as the first of that art, the books I read as a child have affected the most core parts of myself. The specific way I appreciate independence and self-sufficiency is ripped from my side of the mountain. My sense of humor and general demeanor have echoes of the Phantom Tollbooth. My love for adventure and whimsy, along with many of my beliefs about gender, can be seen in The Enchanted Forest. And my understanding of violence, interpersonal relationships, and emotional and mental instability was acquired from a series of books nominally about animals.
Concord flies in my room, tears the house to shreds, defines the night as such a home for us, stick insects, and leaves no trace of love at every market town that we intersect.